So picture this. It's the middle of 2025, and just out of nowhere, the United States unleashes this absolute whirlwind of major trade actions. Global markets are sent spinning. One minute, everything seems fine, and the next, it feels like decades of trade policy are just being torn up and rewritten in a matter of weeks. So what on earth just happened?
All right, to get our heads around this, we're going to break it all down in this explainer. We'll kick things off with that initial tariff storm, then we'll unpack the playbook behind it all. After that, we'll dig into the official reasoning, see how different countries made out, and finally, ask the big question: what does this all mean for the future?
Okay, let's dive right in. It all kicked off with this series of rapid-fire announcements. And I mean rapid fire. It basically put every single U.S. trading partner on notice, and the sheer speed of it all was just staggering.
I mean, just look at this timeline. It was a dizzying 4 months. It starts in April with this Liberation Day threat of what they called reciprocal tariffs against pretty much everybody. Then boom, June hits, and existing steel and aluminum tariffs get doubled. By the end of July, you've got a new 50% tariff on copper, this really unique 40% tariff on Brazil, and then the original tariffs get locked in for dozens of other countries. This wasn't some slow policy change. It was a full-on trade blitz.
You know, in the middle of all that chaos, a really clear pattern started to show itself. Analysts quickly gave it a name: the threaten and settle playbook. And once you see it, you understand the core strategy behind all these moves. So here's how it works. It's a pretty simple three-step dance. Step 1, the threat. You hit a country with a massive headline-grabbing tariff rate that gets everyone's attention. Step 2, the demand. You use that threat to drag them to the negotiating table and ask for huge concessions. And finally, step 3, the settlement. You agree to a final tariff that's, lower than the crazy opening threat, but here's the kicker. It's almost always higher than it was before this whole thing started.
And you can see this playbook in action perfectly right here. The EU, they were threatened with a 50% tariff. They ended up pledging over $1 trillion in U.S. buys and investments just to get that number down to 15%. Japan got hit with a 35% threat, and they also settled at 15%, but only after making their own huge investment pledges. The UK saw a 25% threat turn into a 10% final tariff, but they had to make deals on planes and agriculture. So in every case, you see the pattern. Countries end up with higher tariffs than before, and they had to give something up to get there.
So you have to ask, what's the official reason for such a dramatic shift? I mean, the White House wasn't just slapping on tariffs randomly. They were carefully building a legal and political case for them, and it really rested on two different arguments.
And here they are, the two pillars of the strategy. For industrial stuff like copper, steel, and aluminum, the argument is a classic: national security. The claim is that relying on imports for these materials is a threat to the country. But then for actions against a specific country like Brazil, the reasoning gets way broader. There, they're citing threats to U.S. economic interests, foreign policy, and even the free expression rights of American citizens.
Now, this whole national security thing isn't just talk. It's actually rooted in a very specific and very powerful piece of law. Section 232 gives the president a ton of power to act on trade without Congress, as long as an investigation finds that, yes, there's a threat to national security. But look, this big pivot away from the old system of global trade rules, it didn't just happen overnight. As this quote points out, this has been brewing for years. There's been this growing frustration in Washington from both parties that the World Trade Organization, the WTO, just wasn't working for the U.S. anymore. In fact, the U.S. has been blocking judges to the WTO's top court for years, basically grinding the old system to a halt long before this latest tariff storm. And this chart really gets to the heart of the fairness argument from the White House. They point to data just like this to say, hey, look, before all this started, the U.S. had one of the lowest average tariff rates out there. The whole claim is that these new tariffs are just about leveling a playing field that's been tilted against America for a long, long time. Okay, so now that we've got the strategy and the justification down, let's look at how it all actually played out on the ground. Because not every country got the same deal, not by a long shot. And what we're left with is this really complex patchwork map of global trade. You can see a really clear fork in the road here. Allies, like the EU and Japan, they got the threaten and settle treatment. They ended up with negotiated deals, but still higher tariffs. Brazil, on the other hand, got hit with a 40% tariff for reasons that, frankly, had nothing to do with trade reciprocity and everything to do with its domestic policies.
And the case with Mexico is just fascinating because it really highlights the diplomatic spin going on. The White House came out and said Mexico offered to remove all these other trade barriers to get the deal done. But then Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, publicly said, nope, the agreement didn't require any new action from them at all. So who's telling the truth?
Well, from Mexico's point of view, the deal was a huge win, but for a totally different reason. Their Secretary of Economy basically laid it out. Their main goal wasn't to avoid tariffs forever. It was just to keep their big free trade agreement, the USMCA, alive and kicking until its scheduled review in 2026. By getting a 90-day pause, they did exactly that. It was all about running out the clock.
And this one number, explains everything about their strategy. A whopping 84.4% of Mexico's trade with the U.S. is already covered by that free trade deal. That means all of those goods are totally exempt from these new tariffs anyway. For Mexico, protecting that 84.4%, that was the entire game.
So after all that deal-making, all that drama, where does that leave global trade? The White House definitely shook things up. There's no doubt about it. But analysts are pretty quick to say that this new order is, well, it's far from settled. There are some major unanswered questions hanging in the air. And there are some really serious catches to this whole new approach. First, are those big concessions ever actually going to happen? The EU is already calling its massive pledges mere intentions, not binding deals. Second, there's this weird economic puzzle. If you force countries to invest in the US, that makes the dollar stronger, which can actually make the trade deficit worse. And finally, there's inflation. Right now, businesses are mostly eating the costs, but if these tariffs stick around, those costs are going to get passed on to us.
And that, of course, brings us to the elephant in the room. As this quote points out, for all the deals made with allies, the fundamental problem of the U.S. trade deficit is tied directly to China's huge surpluses. Without a real, comprehensive deal with China, all these other agreements might just be, well, rearranging the deck chairs.
And so that leaves us with the one big defining question for this whole new era. The old rulebook is gone, the WTO system is on the sidelines, we are now living in a world of one-off deals, unilateral moves, and constant negotiation. And in this new, unsettled order, the biggest question of all might just be, how does anyone even know if they're winning anymore?